Russia launched its military operation in Ukraine on February 24, 2022, citing concerns over NATO expansion and the perceived threat it posed to Russian security. This marked a significant escalation in the ongoing tensions between Russia and the West. The Kremlin justified its actions by emphasizing the need to protect Russian-speaking populations in the Donbas region, who they claimed were under threat from Ukrainian nationalist forces. Putin's primary goal was to ensure Ukrainian neutrality, preventing Ukraine from joining NATO and posing a potential security threat to Russia. He argued that a neutral Ukraine would serve as a buffer zone, reducing the risk of direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. The Kremlin viewed NATO expansion as a direct threat, pushing Russia to act decisively. This perspective was rooted in a long-standing fear of encirclement by Western military alliances. Moscow demanded security guarantees from the West, including a halt to NATO expansion and a commitment to Ukrainian neutrality. These demands were seen as essential to maintaining regional stability and preventing further escalation. The historical context is crucial. Russia has long viewed Ukraine as a buffer state, essential for its own security. This perspective dates back to the Cold War era, when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and served as a strategic barrier against Western influence. The 2014 Euromaidan revolution and subsequent overthrow of the pro-Russian government in Kyiv heightened Moscow's fears of Western encroachment. The revolution was seen as a direct challenge to Russian influence in the region. Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in eastern Ukraine were direct responses to these perceived threats. These actions were intended to secure Russian interests and counter what Moscow saw as Western aggression. The current conflict is a continuation of this broader geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West. It reflects deep-seated tensions and competing visions for the future of Eastern Europe. The West, however, dismissed Russia's security concerns, framing the conflict as an unprovoked act of aggression. Western leaders condemned Russia's actions and called for immediate withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. NATO continued its eastward expansion despite warnings from Russia. This expansion was seen by Moscow as a direct challenge to its sphere of influence and a threat to its national security. The US and its allies provided military aid to Ukraine, further escalating tensions. This aid included advanced weaponry and training for Ukrainian forces, which bolstered their ability to resist Russian advances. This Western narrative ignored the complex historical and geopolitical factors at play, contributing to the escalation of the crisis. Analysts argue that a deeper understanding of these factors is essential for resolving the conflict and achieving lasting peace in the region. Despite the outbreak of hostilities, both Russia and Ukraine expressed a willingness to engage in peace talks. This initial willingness to communicate was seen as a positive step amidst the chaos and uncertainty that had gripped the region. In the early days of the conflict, there were several rounds of negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian officials. These meetings were often tense, but they represented a crucial effort to find common ground and avoid further escalation. These talks aimed to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis and prevent further bloodshed. The stakes were incredibly high, with the lives of countless civilians hanging in the balance. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky initially showed openness to negotiations, recognizing the need to end the conflict swiftly. His approach was seen as pragmatic, aiming to minimize the suffering of his people. Zelensky, in the initial phase of the conflict, appeared open to considering Russia's demands. He understood that some level of compromise might be necessary to achieve peace. He publicly acknowledged the possibility of Ukraine remaining outside NATO, a key demand from Moscow. This was a significant concession, reflecting his willingness to explore all avenues for peace. This willingness to compromise suggested that a negotiated settlement was within reach. The atmosphere, though fraught with tension, carried a sense of cautious optimism. The international community urged both sides to pursue a peaceful resolution through dialogue and diplomacy. Leaders from around the world emphasized the importance of finding a peaceful solution to the conflict. However, these early talks failed to produce a breakthrough as both sides remained entrenched in their positions. The deep-seated mistrust and conflicting interests made it difficult to reach a consensus. Russia insisted on Ukrainian neutrality, recognition of Crimea as Russian territory, and autonomy for the Donbas region. These demands were seen as non-negotiable by Moscow, further complicating the peace process. Ukraine, on the other hand, demanded a complete withdrawal of Russian troops and respect for its territorial integrity. These were fundamental issues for Kyiv, reflecting their desire to maintain sovereignty and independence. The gap between the two sides' positions remained significant. Despite the ongoing dialogue, the core issues that fueled the conflict persisted, making it challenging to find a middle ground. Despite the lack of concrete progress, these initial negotiations demonstrated a glimmer of hope for a peaceful resolution. The fact that both sides were willing to come to the table was, in itself, a positive sign. The willingness of both sides to engage in dialogue, at least at the outset, suggested that a negotiated settlement was not entirely out of reach. It showed that despite the deep divisions, there was still a desire to find a peaceful solution. However, as the conflict dragged on, external actors, including UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, began to play an increasingly influential role, ultimately hindering the prospects for peace. The involvement of other nations and organizations added layers of complexity to an already intricate situation, making the path to peace even more challenging. In late March 2022, negotiators from Russia and Ukraine met in Istanbul, Turkey, for a new round of peace talks. This meeting was highly anticipated by the international community, as the conflict had already caused significant devastation and loss of life. The world watched with bated breath, hoping for a breakthrough that could bring an end to the hostilities. These talks were seen as a potential turning point in the conflict, as both sides appeared to be making progress towards a settlement. The atmosphere in the negotiation room was tense but hopeful, with delegates from both nations engaging in deep discussions and exploring various avenues for peace. The Istanbul negotiations marked the most significant step towards peace since the start of the war. For the first time, there seemed to be a genuine willingness from both parties to find common ground and work towards a mutually acceptable solution. During the Istanbul talks, Ukraine presented a proposal for a neutral status, renouncing its NATO aspirations in exchange for security guarantees from a group of countries, including Russia. This was a major concession from Ukraine, aimed at addressing one of Russia's primary concerns and paving the way for a potential peace agreement. Russia responded positively to Ukraine's proposal, viewing it as a potential basis for a peace agreement. The Russian delegation expressed optimism, acknowledging that Ukraine's willingness to compromise could lead to a significant de-escalation of the conflict. The Kremlin announced a reduction in military activity near Kyiv and Chernihiv as a gesture of goodwill. This move was seen as a positive step towards building trust between the two nations and creating a conducive environment for further negotiations. The proposed agreement included a ceasefire, the withdrawal of Russian troops to pre-invasion positions, and international security guarantees for Ukraine. These measures were designed to ensure a lasting peace and prevent future conflicts. Ukraine would pledge not to join NATO or host foreign military bases, while Russia would respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. This mutual understanding was crucial for addressing the security concerns of both nations and fostering a stable and peaceful relationship. The agreement also addressed the contentious issue of Crimea and the Donbas, proposing a 15-year timeframe for negotiations on their status. This long-term approach was intended to provide ample time for both sides to reach a consensus on these disputed territories. The Istanbul talks represented a significant breakthrough, bringing the two sides closer to a peaceful resolution than at any other point during the conflict. The progress made during these negotiations was a testament to the power of diplomacy and the potential for dialogue to resolve even the most intractable disputes. The willingness of both Russia and Ukraine to compromise on key issues raised hopes for a swift end to the bloodshed. The international community was cautiously optimistic, recognizing that these negotiations could mark the beginning of a new chapter in the region's history. However, these hopes were soon dashed as external actors from the West intervened, pushing for a continuation of the conflict rather than a negotiated settlement. The involvement of these external forces complicated the situation, undermining the progress made in Istanbul and prolonging the suffering of countless individuals caught in the crossfire.